In continuing with this particular subject, I have a story of my own to tell. There was a little bit about this in my first book, but now it's time to go in depth and uncover the feelings that took place and the grieving I felt at losing not only my home, but pets and my husband all at the same time. Chapter 6: Release. My husband and I had been growing apart for probably the last half of our relationship. We had already separated once, and to be honest, it was at that time my trust in him and my faith in our future was on shaky ground. Fast forward to the last couple of years of our marriage, I had received a letter from my ex's dad, FedEx no less, concerning some things that happened within his family that I won't disclose in this book out of respect for his sisters and their privacy. What I learned in this letter made me realize that the man I thought I knew all those years, I really didn't know. And more than that, I really didn't want to be with anyone like that anymore. But I wasn't going to be the one to leave. We began to sleep in separate rooms. He begged me not to leave him, and I assured him I wouldn't. I just couldn't bring myself to be near him anymore. You know, it's funny. Our friends, my family, everyone thought they knew him, including myself, and they thought things were one way when in fact they knew nothing of what it was really like in my world. He wasn't at all who everyone thought he was. I was made to look like the bad one when they had no idea the secrets I was forced to keep and the neglect I put up with. I suppose you could say my feeling of loss began when he left me the first time. I need to interject something important here. When my ex left me the first time, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't eat. I've had my issues with my mom and me feeling like she really hasn't been there for me a lot, but I still remember waking up after that first night of my ex being gone. I had finally cried myself to sleep, totally exhausted. When I woke up, my mom was sitting in the chair in the corner of my room. She had been keeping watch over me because she knew how broken up I was and how much my heart was hurting. To this day, I felt very much loved by my mother in that moment. I felt at least in that moment she understood my pain. Thank you, Mommy. Now back to my story. That's when I began to mourn the end of our relationship. It may not have ended there, but I knew it would end someday. And because he left without warning and without facing me, I knew he'd probably leave again someday when I least expected it. But I had no idea he'd leave me in such a devastating and destitute situation. I'll get to that in just a moment. When we got back together, I began to feel the loss of my dignity. Why on earth did I take back someone who had wronged me so badly? You see, the first time he left, he smiled as always, held me the night before, and said, "I love you," as he walked out the door and drove my car to work. When I went to the bank to withdraw the money to pay our bills, including our rent, I had been removed from the account. I stood in the bank as it began to spin around me, and I felt betrayed, I felt hurt and angry. I called him and told him to bring my car back to the house. Once I got home, he kept me on the phone for a while, explaining himself, and then suddenly my car was in front of the house. He had someone bring the car and leave the keys in the car, completely out of gas. Well, as I said, we got back together after a few weeks. Something gnawed at me deep inside that I was doing the wrong thing, but I did, believe it or not, love him. Only now I couldn't trust him. Oh, it was a living nightmare at that point. I couldn't be with him anymore without picturing him with those other girls he had been with while we were apart. More loss of dignity. Why was I staying? Okay, let's fast forward. Another few years go by and things improve financially for the most part. I endured long hours alone while my husband worked hard to become an electrician. This isn't a poor me thing either. I'm not completely innocent. While he was away, I did seek comfort and understanding in all the wrong places, and so did he. He admitted to having coffee with a woman after work. She was a teller at the bank we did business with. Instead of coming to bed, he spent most nights on his computer promising love to other women and wishing he were with them. Oh, sure, I knew the end was coming, but I couldn't bring myself to be the one to leave. Plus, I wasn't prepared to take care of myself. One car made it difficult, if not impossible, for me to seek work and start saving money. He refused to put my name on the title. He went and got himself a new car after destroying the transmission in mine and then my stepdad's vehicles. Yeah, hindsight is definitely 2020. You can see all the steps he was taking to prepare himself to leave, and with no regard to what would happen to me. So, blah, 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 after a while, he let us get evicted from our home. Instead of renting another house or catching up the rent where we were, he put us in a motel, quite easily more expensive than paying rent. I never saw him. He claimed to have 2 jobs. He'd pop his head in the door for a few minutes between jobs and be gone again. I seriously suspect, though can't prove, that he had already begun living with this other woman. Well, one night he popped his head in the door for the last time. I said, "I love you," and he was leaving, and he refused to say it back. He just gave me a strange look like, "Come on now." About 3 a.m., he still wasn't back, and I got no return texts or answers on his phone. The next morning, I received a call from his boss asking me, "What will it take to make you happy and end this marriage?" Why was his boss calling me? Why was he asking me this question? My husband was a coward. There is no other word for it. I refused, of course, to talk to his boss about my marriage. Instead, I told him to tell my husband, who was standing in the same room, that he'd hear from my lawyer. I was completely devastated, and while part of me was so glad my marriage was over at last, I had no idea what I was going to do or how I was going to move forward. I was not prepared to take care of myself. He left me in a motel room with no home, no money, no food, no car, 3 pets. I went into survival mode. I had a friend on the phone guiding me step by step. More on this friend later. And I simply did what I was told because my brain had shut down. I can't explain how this feels except you turn into a robot, and if not for this friend telling me what to do every second, I can promise you that I wouldn't be here to write this book today. He sent me a little money and told me what to buy for nourishment until my best friend could come get me, which would be 3 days later. I begged the motel manager for an extra day after explaining what had happened. I had no choice but to call the Humane Society and put my pets up for adoption. Survival mode. At this point, I was too humiliated and embarrassed to tell my family what had happened, as if I were to blame for his cowardliness. The next 3 days began a 3-month journey that both closed and opened doors within myself. Chapter 7. Surrender of control and newfound strength. I realize the title to this chapter seems contradictory to itself, but hopefully, as you read through it, you will come to understand it. As the realization of what had just happened to me set in, I dropped to the floor. I couldn't stand. I had no physical strength. I lost my desire to keep going. I saw no way to move forward from this. I felt betrayed, rejected, worthless. If I wasn't good enough for someone who could do something like that to another person, a person they spent 12 years with, a person they made vows to before God, what did that say about me? I had no idea what to do. I contacted my best friend, and she didn't even hesitate, but it would take her a few days due to work to come and get me. In fact, she insisted that I was in no position to argue. Back to the part where I dropped to the floor. While I was sitting on the floor, a penny fell from nowhere. I heard it hit the floor. I had heard of pennies from heaven, and I wanted to believe that was Daddy letting me know he was there and that everything would be all right. But I was hard-pressed to believe things could be all right, at least at this point. I contacted this friend of mine. I told him what had happened, and he immediately took over. He took over my thoughts. He took over my every move, my sleeping pattern. He sent me a little money and told me what to buy so that I wouldn't starve over the next 3 days. He connected with me on Skype and said that for the next 3 days, until my best friend got there, he would stay with me 24/7. He would stay connected to me, and he did, day and night. If we weren't on Skype, he was on the phone with me. He made me leave the motel room and take walks with him on the phone. He made me talk. He made me express my feelings. He didn't want me to think too far into the future, but only be concerned about here and now, survival mode. He stayed and talked with me until I fell asleep on Skype. He was there when I woke up. He told me when to shower, when to eat, when to sleep. He quite literally told me what move to make and when for the next 3 days. As strange as that might sound to some, I was appreciative because without him, as I said, I wouldn't be here to write this book today. When my best friend showed up, I must have still been in zombie mode, autopilot. She and her friend came in and loaded up my belongings. I got in the car with my friend on the phone. He continued to stay on the phone with me as much as he could during the 9-hour ride. I was completely out of sorts. I don't remember the conversation with my best friend or her friend on the way to her house. I barely remember the car ride. When we got to her house and brought my things inside, she set me up on her love seat. I opened up Skype and there I was. I'm just going to call it what it is. He became someone to me. I learned a new term, dominant. He, in my opinion, mentally and emotionally rescued me. For 3 months, he continued to tell me when to sleep, which was about 2 hours a night, when to eat, which was barely anything, although I lost my first 100 pounds in that 3 months. I was introduced to a world that I knew very little of. What you are about to read are things that, if you know me, may shock and surprise you. If you don't, will still be revealing. While I'm not ashamed of those 3 months because it's in those 3 months that I found a part of myself that today I draw from, because it gives me strength and it's not as if I had been of clear mind, a decision I would have made consciously. But this man took over my mind, my emotions, my thoughts, my sleep, my eating, even my breathing. I did things for him willingly because in return, I received praise and the feeling of being worthy again. This is not an easy chapter to write, but a necessary one to demonstrate the loss of self, the loss of that which makes you, you, because of the actions of another, because someone made me feel unworthy. The following, now let me state this correctly, I allowed the following to happen. In some sense, it truly was out of my control. Mentally, as I said, I really was not at all with it. I was in some form of shock, but I don't want to make it sound as if I am not taking some responsibility for these things, because I do. Now, during this time on my best friend's love seat, I was also taking care of her newborn granddaughter. Don't ask me how. She's probably the only reason I didn't completely lose my mind. I think she kept me grounded just enough so I stayed this side of sanity. I still never left the love seat unless given permission to. They put her in my arms before they left with everything I'd need close by and take her from me when they got home. She slept most of the time and was a good baby. Let's give this man who had been controlling me a name. Let's call him Kirk. This was a form of control. In fact, it was the very definition of control. But I was willingly giving him that control. Over those 3 months, I would learn and experience a world most folks only read about. This was no storybook of romanticized ideas of BDSM. This was real life. I was being taught, and in fact trained, to submit my will to another. Yes, although this was over the internet, it had very real implications. I did things to myself physically, emotionally, and mentally for Kirk. Weak? No, I was anything but weak. Confused? Yes, I was definitely confused. But it takes a very strong person, contrary to popular belief, in order to allow someone else to control you. They can only control you as much as you let them, and I was a very willing victim. I went so far as to rent a motel room for a weekend so that he and I could be alone via Skype, where he instructed me to do things to my body which put my mind on a whole other realm of existence. I'm sure I've lost most of you by now, and there are probably some questions you're asking, such as what is BDSM? What do you mean by putting your mind on a whole other realm of existence? This book isn't about BDSM. It's about healing after various types of losses. And I don't want to lose that focus, so my suggestion to you is to look up BDSM in something called Subspace. This experience was no make believe story of lust and obedience. This was the real thing. So, back to my giving up control to Kirk. I think it's important to remind you at this point that I was in a very vulnerable state already. But this man most certainly did take my mind off of what had happened to me. He was forcing me to lose weight by controlling my food portions, and healthy or not, I felt worthy, loved, and accepted. At the time, I didn't see it as twisted or wrong. As those weeks passed, he had gotten so deep into my head, I totally lost myself. He chanted the same phrase to me every night, which put me in a deep sleep. You only hear your master's voice. For the longest time since then, I couldn't remember that phrase. I didn't want to. Only recently it's come back to me, and I have to still be careful when reciting it in telling the story, because it is a dangerous phrase for me. That's how much of a hold he had over me. So with that phrase, he'd put me to sleep every night. And after about 2 hours of sleep, he'd wake me by yelling into my headphones, "Girl!" over and over until he heard me waking up. One night it was simply because he wanted my company. He wanted to talk. Other nights it was to perform some tedious task online. My best friend became increasingly alarmed. She could no longer reach me. No one could. One night she convinced Kirk to allow me to go with her shopping, to get me away from the computer, off the love seat, and him out of my head for a little while. I very reluctantly went. My mind, however, rejected the idea. At the store, we weren't in the door but a few minutes, and I think I started to space out. I remember sitting on the bench near the door, and my best friend must have gotten him on the phone. I don't know what he told me, but I know I heard his voice. I sat there quietly in my own world while they did their shopping. On the ride home, my best friend said that I was singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, like a little kid. I was gone. I don't remember much of that ride home. She got me home and hooked me up to him. Then I suddenly was fine. That experience is what I came to understand as subdrop. What does any of this have to do with grief? Can't you see it? I was grieving the end of my marriage. I was grieving the absence of a man I had come to know as my master. Worst of all, I was grieving the loss of me. There was this routine. He had me set out a virtual, an imaginary glass of water every day because he kept one on his desk in real life. I would act this out. One day I forgot. He proceeded to lecture me for 4 hours about this. He stated that my submission was terrific, but my servitude sucked. Excuse me? I was attached quite literally to my laptop, headphones on my ears, sleeping, eating, breathing, just as he told me, 24/7. And here I was getting a lecture about how my servitude sucked over a fake glass of water. After about the third hour, something in me snapped. I began to cry, but not from sadness, from anger. He heard the change in my voice and started saying, "Let go of the anger." No, I had reached a breaking point. Something in me woke up. Plans had been made for me to move to California to be with him. He even sent a bus ticket. I was excited about this until this lecture. That night, as he slept, I typed out a long email. Now, in this world, there are protocols. Not all follow them to the letter. In fact, most make up the rules within their own relationship. But in the world of BDSM, if you have a master and you want to leave, you are supposed to be released. before you can end the relationship. In the beginning, he and I agreed that if either of us were to come to this decision, we would take 24 hours to think it over and then discuss it. This rule was set in place because of the way my husband had left me, because of my feelings of abandonment. Well, as I said, that night I typed out a long email detailing how I felt. Now, knowing him like I did, I knew with no uncertainty this would no doubt be cause for my release. But I expected him to be a man of his word. After all, he spent a lot of time building me back up, saving me from devastation. After typing out the email, I slowly and reluctantly removed my headphones and closed down Skype and closed my computer. I didn't sleep much that night. In fact, I still heard his voice in my head. You only hear your master's voice. I think I chanted it to myself till I drifted off. The next morning, I checked my email to see what he had to say. There was nothing. I logged into Skype. Nothing. He simply disappeared. To this day, we have not spoken. My best friend was very supportive, but knew that this, even more than my husband leaving, would take some serious effort on my part to get over. I had to be strong, and I was. I was blessed enough to have many friends who all gently guided me back to health mentally and emotionally. It was a lot of work, painful nights, emotional breakdowns, but I did come back to myself. And I am proud to say that while I have gone through real life experiences in that type of world since then, I have never lost myself again. Thanks to Kurt, I know the warning signs. But I do have to give him credit for pushing me past the pain of my ex leaving, teaching me about that part of myself, and in fact, forcing me to find the strength within myself to stand up for myself. He was strict, he was a sadist, but for all I resent him for, it was he who taught me how to be in control of me.